Let me relay to you the most dreadful of scenarios. A 2.5-year-old being potty trained has an accident, and the events that unfold result in the sexual molestation, torture and eventual beating to death of this little girl. A 63-year-old grandmother is stabbed to death in her car, and the killer forces her granddaughter to drive alongside her lifeless body. These examples above are real, and the men convicted of those crimes will be among the first to be affected by the new federal death penalty declared by Donald Trump. The arguments for and against capital punishment may divide many of us, and they deserve to be deeper than our initial emotional reactions. Indeed, in researching this topic, I've seen my own view flip-flopping forward and back. But I've reached the sad conclusion that there are some people who are so far outside the confines of a civil society, who are truly beyond the realm of redemption and rehabilitation, and who have disregarded the human rights of others in the most brutal ways. And for those exceptional circumstances, once the burden of proof has been entirely fulfilled, it is justified that capital punishment should be considered at least.
Michelle, I actually don't think it's possible for me to disagree with you more on this subject.
I was expecting that.
You're talking about civil society. Now, I think that any civil society should have as a minimum that the state, the government, does not kill its own citizens. When you look at the countries that do that, we have Iran, North Korea, China, Saudi Arabia. No coincidence that they're some of the most repressive regimes in the world. And that's not the sort of company that I would wish to be in. So just on moral and ethical grounds, I really strongly disagree. But aside from all of that, we have the practical grounds. So most of the experts on this issue are saying that the death penalty does not work as a deterrent to some of the most appalling crimes, like the ones that you're describing, which are completely horrific. It also that runs the risk of killing an innocent person. Since 1973, 166 people on death row have been exonerated and cleared. And the other problem is that there are half of the people sitting on death row are people of colour. So we have a system that is racially biased, and I think that's another serious concern.
I'm absolutely with Rachel too, yes. On this. I think there's no argument for on terms of cost, there's an argument against it in terms of risk and in terms of the prejudice against people of colour, half of whom are sitting in death row, which is a disproportionate number. The other thing I would say is we don't dispute the horrible crimes that people do. What we're disputing is whether it's right for the state or even the federal government to kill those people for those crimes. And I think that the prejudice that it causes in terms of society at large is too great for us to carry that risk. So let's just hear now from Robert Brett Dunham, who's the Executive Director of the Death Penalty Information Centre.
It has emphasised the very rare examples of murders committed by immigrants as a way to suggest to the American public and to the world at large that immigrants pose a disproportionate danger to the American public. The facts show that's not the case. It's an argument that plays into the rhetorical campaign that we've been seeing in Washington.
Exactly. So what Brett Dunham is saying is that Donald Trump is using this as a wedge issue in the election against minorities and to whip up his base.
And let's not forget, guys, this is the very same man who in 1989 took out a full-page advert that he paid for from his own money saying bring back the death penalty, which led to the conviction of 5 innocent young black teenagers who were convicted wrongfully of raping a jogger in Central Park. They spent years in jail, all these young black kids. Trump whipped up a mob against them and he wanted them to be executed. Had he succeeded, 5 innocent black teenagers not only would have had their lives ruined, they would have had no lives left. And, of course, they were completely exonerated eventually through DNA evidence. And what concerns me, and it's a point you touched on with your response to Michelle, Rachel, and that is that if you look at the 5 countries, Michelle, in the world that have this as the ones that execute the most commonly in the world, China, you know, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam and Iraq are the top 5. Why would anyone want to join that club? Because the value they place on life and death in those societies is clearly not that much. And what I worry about isn't that these people deserve to be executed. What I worry about is who deserves to be the executioner and what that does to a society when it places life and death in the hands of a process that
Is it
could go wrong.
anti-Christian?
Well, it's not. I just want to follow Maajid's point, because I think the bigger problem here is that you say it's about heinous crimes. The problem is different societies will have a different idea of what is heinous. Mm-hmm. So in some societies, you profess the wrong religion, bang, it's all over. Mm-hmm. Some societies, you are gay or lesbian, bang, it's all done. Now, so this idea that actually, you know, there's a kind of standard that says you can be done in for this, that and the other, it's just not true. It's actually just cultural.
Stoned to death for adultery. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
How would that play here?
As we have seen. And the other point I really wanted to make about this is that, you know, you say that Trump may think he's, at some level, some kind of divinity, but the problem is, when he does these things, if those guys had been executed, you can't bring them back.
Yep, I
agree.
agree.
We are not gods. And that's what I think is a real problem
And
here.
what would have been the sanction against Donald Trump?
Yeah, well...
Yeah.
So, I have thought through what many of you have said, because for me personally, I always used to reply to this issue emotively. So I used to hear, oh my God, this is a horrible crime. Yes, they deserve this. And then I started challenging myself for the purpose of this debate. And what I'm listening to you guys arguing with me against is wrongful execution. So where the wrong person has been executed, which I agree is terrible and shouldn't happen. We make human judgments based on who's guilty and who's not. We don't need to be doing that anymore. The death penalty should only be applied if indeed it is going to be. And by the way...
But some of us are making the argument that we are not the people who can make that judgment.
I'm not skipping down the lane
the human
saying
out of the judgment as well.
Capital punishment, but in the cases where there is indisputable scientific evidence, and the cases that you're referring to, Central Park joggers, that's decades ago, and DNA has moved on. In fact, it was DNA that helped clear them. If there's indisputable DNA evidence that somebody has committed a heinous crime,
what do you do?
And I'm not talking about.
What do you do about the case that we've seen in China quite recently, where a guy was done, and then they discovered that actually he'd been fitted up by the police.
He was
Listen, I'm not
executed.
He was already
I am
killed.
not discussing these backward nations.
Right. No,
which,
that's
for example,
China backward.
No,
Come on.
I am talking about your
Come on.
Can I show you a backward
just wait,
nation?
because I always listen to you lot, and I always get talked
do,
over, and I'm not
you do.
doing it on this topic because I'm very passionate about it. And at the end of the day, what I think is if you have a system in place that is going to counter the things. So you're saying about its prejudice. Well, actually, if you had a fairer system in place, you're saying about wrongful things. If you use proper DNA, then we're talking about, at the end of the day, you have to think, why do you want somebody? If you imagine a child, and I know you've got children, Maajid, imagine the horrific scenario where somebody has sexually molested your child, has tortured them, and then battered them to death. What do you want to do? Stick them in a prison?
Now, Michelle, this is exactly the point I'm making. Of course, I'd want to kill that person, and the question is, should I be allowed to kill that person?
Not you, no.
No, if I was left to my own devices, I would kill that person. Should society tolerate my emotional reaction to the torture of my own child? No, because what does it do to society? Let's have a look at this map. Look at the US. Look at how many states have the death penalty. That's 29 states in which they kill people. Now, I think it's not a coincidence that the United States of America, that legally sanctions the death penalty, also has a prison population higher than some countries and has mass shootings in malls and everyone's carrying guns around, because the value of life and death in cultures that legally sanction executing people is you've got to admit, is lower than in those societies where they don't. It's simply, you know, we can observe that. So my point is what it does to us, not what it Not that the criminal may deserve
human
it.
life, and Amnesty International, they keep talking about human rights and human life. Valuing human rights is a two-way contract. You cannot breach people's human rights left, right and centre and then sit there crying they respect my human rights, please.
You're not addressing my point.
You're sitting in prison for life.
But also, you're not
half the time, these people in the UK, people get life. They don't sit there for their full lives, Rachel.
What would it do to you if you executed somebody? That's my point.
Well, I wouldn't
not whether
execute
they
anyone.
deserve.
I wouldn't execute anyone. That would be weird, and I would be a murderer. But I don't work in that system.
Yeah.